Welcome back to Half Past Capitalism, where we talk about alternatives to capitalism as if they were possible. This show is part of the Harbinger Media Network and is sponsored by SEAS. That's the Solidarity Economy Incubator for Zero Emissions here in Montreal. Today, we're speaking with Aminah Sheikh, a union organizer and socialist based in Ontario, Canada. She's currently working with the Public Service Alliance of Canada and was recently elected the vice president of the Canadian Freelancers Union. Welcome, Aminah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you. Yeah, so I'm excited to chat about a whole bunch of things: organizing, internationalism, the post-capitalist imagination. I wanted to ask you a question that I used to start these interviews with, which I sort of a tradition that I want to revive, and that's: when was the last time you encountered something in your daily life that you would call capitalism?
Yes. Well, in my daily life, I'm constantly encountering capitalism. Right now in Toronto, we are seeing snowfall at a higher amount, and people are waking up and they still have to rush to work. And with that rush to work and the lack of support from public infrastructure and public funding from our governments, I see people agitated and angry all around me. And I think that is the result of capitalism. I think the exhaustion, the anger, but the persistence from workers to get to work on time and to be there, is also a result of capitalism. And, living in the city of Toronto, and I'm sure it's in other cities too, it's like they call it the grind, and it's really, you really see it every day because people are just overworked and waiting for buses and waiting for the roads to be plowed, all just to go to work and do the cycle of working, 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 rather than maybe we should just take the day off and everyone should just rest and do the other work that we have to do, like take care of our families and feed ourselves and rest.
So you see the sort of capitalism happening in that sort of exigency to just like, you have to be at work, or your means of survival is going to be sort of removed, or like, yeah, what are you sort of zeroing in on there?
I feel like, and maybe we'll be discussing this, I think a lot has happened like in the pandemic and then post-pandemic, if we're in a post-pandemic, and the lack of funding, across Canada and across North America, for people, but the subsidization of capitalism and industry continues. And really what the result has been is, I think we've gone past a boiling point. I think that people are so angry. People here in the city are very unfriendly, and I hear that all the time. And I was born and raised here. Of course, I'm a settler, but like I was born and raised here, and it's changed a lot. People just can't have patience because they're not really afforded that. The system creates this sort of rush, rush, rush. You got to get to work, then you have to get your child, then you have to, put dinner down on the table, and it's really like people here are like pushing on to get on buses. People are like rushing everywhere. There's no patience in the grocery stores, and that's really what we're seeing in this city. It's become unlivable.
Yeah, so yeah, just sort of pervasive and how people are even living their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think that sort of segues perfectly into the sort of main thing that I wanted to talk to you about, which is, you're a labor organizer, and I'm not sure everybody knows what exactly that means. So I'd love if you just want to paint a bit of a picture of what that looks like, in a typical day of organizing workers. Like what does that look like?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking me that as well, because I think people don't really know what it means. And as I've been doing it for 10 years now, it's interesting. I'm trying to recruit people who were like myself. I graduated with a gender studies degree and I did a master's, and I came out kind of struggling, confused, and I got picked up by one of the largest unions in North America, SEIU. I know you're familiar with it. And that's when I became a labor organizer. And labor organizing really is about talking to workers, and really focused on building workers to, transform their own lives by themselves. And what organizers really do, we're kind of like coaches. We support the workers, we help them by providing resources that they may not have. Resources meaning, we help them get to meetings, we help them book meetings, but we help bring them together and bring a space for them to collectively discuss how to transform their work lives. Because their work lives have often rendered them to feel powerless, the union is sort of this vehicle to give them power back. And the steps to that power back is organizing. Organizing in itself, I often say, is like what's uplifting, because them coming together, especially in this, again, what I've been talking about with my own city, Toronto, the alienation, the rush, the isolation, union organizing and labor organizers bring people together to start having those conversations, building relationships, and cultivating community.
So in some ways, you're sort of taking that sort of that rush and that anger and that sort of frustration of constantly doing, too much with too little, and turning it into, I don't know, it sounds like the potential for collective action, the potential for community, the potential for, sort of de-alienating your workplace. I guess I'm wondering, if you agree with that assessment, and also what's the first step? Like, what is, when somebody's just going to their job, they haven't thought about ever joining a union or anything like that. What's that first step that people have to take to start to build that consciousness?
Yeah, often when workers call a labor organizer, they've started the first step. And that's really like touching base with someone else at the workplace. And so often people who call us are like what we call natural leaders, and people come to them and talk to them about their workplace problems. And they've sort of started that discussion quietly, usually in what we call a quiet phase. And they are having meetings, whether it's like through now what we see through different tools, through different chat groups, off workplace, or whether they're doing it on their coffee breaks, physically outside the workplace. It really begins with sort of connections. And so when they call me, I usually say, you've already started becoming like a union. Like you've already started that process, because they sometimes see the red tape and the bureaucratic process tied to like laws, that prevent people from forming unions. I often want to be encouraging to them and tell them that you've already started it by you all coming together, on your own time and having these conversations about how to improve the workplace. That's the beginning step, because the beginning step is really forming a committee. And we call this like an inside committee. We call this an organizing committee. And that committee is going to be the leaders that sort of build the workplace activism and help disseminate the plans to form a union.
And just about those natural leaders, how do you identify a natural leader? Like, what are the qualities you look for? I have to imagine that there are different qualities that would sort of elevate somebody to be a natural leader, but I'm curious about that.
Yeah. I think over the years, I've really had to remind people in organizing, and I think it's really true. What we say are leaders is actually a leader just has followers. Like the definition is a leader has followers. And why I think it's important to say that is because there's a lot of, and I know me and you know each other through political stuff, but there's a lot of self-selected leaders, right? So there's someone being like, I know everything, and like, I'm really loud, and I challenge when I'm at work, I challenge the situation, or I challenge things and I speak up. But sometimes those really loud people, what's really interesting in organizing is they don't necessarily have followers. They could just be, I'm by myself. I'm really loud. I read Marxist theory and then I come to work and philosophize. But what we find is interesting as organizers is often it's like a quiet person, and it's a person that really accrued respect. And often those people who've really built respect, they built respect from management too. So those people sometimes are actually people who management has an eye on, and will be like, oh, we should be giving them, we should advance them, and they're hard workers. They really have respect, and they're hard workers, and they actually really like the jobs. Lots of times leaders are like, I like this job, like I want to make it better, and that's where you see how workers actually want to improve the workplace. It's not always just them trying to get their deal. to offset the company. But I would say that leaders have followers. And why I say this is because when I first did one of my first organizing drives, and they were cleaners at the Metropolitan University, I'm sure they're still there. There was a leader amongst them. They were all Korean workers, and English was their second language. And so there were challenges for me actually to organize them. But there was one person who was very silent and just took notes throughout the meeting, and I automatically assumed the loudest person was the leader, who was organizing the meetings. We often say those people who execute tasks are activists, but maybe they're not leaders again. But the leader was actually in their community. He was also a faith leader, and they all went to church together in the evening. And but he didn't speak English, but what he did, they followed. Really.
Yeah, so I'd love to hear, like, what are some of the things that create followers, like, and
Yeah.
just from your observation.
I think that people who I've just seen in organizing drives, people who are good leaders are people who people see actually hardworking at work. Like they care about the workplace. Like they're like, in the case of custodial who work inside the universities, or like food workers, or they'll be like, I really care about the students, and we can't do our if we can't help students if we can't do our jobs. So there's this slogan too in education: working conditions are learning conditions. And often when I've seen leaders, whether I'm organizing early childhood educators, custodial, I've organized workers in museums, it's because they actually really care about their job. And like the leader often is like, we want to make this place good. We care about the public. We care about our communities. We're doing important work. And our management is like, jet setting, like in the case of Jeff Bezos, they're not here. They don't even know what we do, and they don't even really respect us. And the leader is the person who's like, not only am I here, I'm present, but I really care about the job. And often other followers respect them and see their work and see it as valuable and are like, yeah, this person should be leading our workplace, and this person cares about us. Another way that they gain leaders have followers is through trust and relationships. They're often the person that people turn to and come and talk to them and confide in them. And there's a lot of relationships that are there. And those people are often the leaders, and they have a lot of following because they take the time to listen and people respect what they have to say.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And so when you get approached, or when you sort of come into a workplace, like, yeah, like what does that journey look like from a natural leader to to somebody who is, I don't know, representing their workers, or their colleagues in a, I don't know, march on the boss, or whatever you're doing. Like what just can you just give a thumbnail sketch, I guess, of what the organizing process looks like once you get involved?
Well, when organizers go into workplaces, they need to pull in leaders, right? Because let's say you're looking at a workplace of 100 people. You're not going to know, like in this hyper alienated world with part-time, contract, you don't even know the workforce, right? You're an outsider also. We have to remember the organizer is a staff person. They're a coach. They're going to provide resources because they're going to have time on their job to do all that background work, list building, providing drives, helping people understand the voting process and forming a union. So you want inside leaders, and you want to recruit those leaders. So the really beginning is you're recruiting people. And that's a second part I was going to tell you, that it's often hard to recruit organic leaders, because often organic leaders, sometimes they just, they don't have time. People have a lot going on in their lives. So you want to recruit them. You want to pull them in, and recruiting them to a committee, an organizing committee, and taking accountability and stepping into that role. And that takes training and it takes time, because just because someone's a leader doesn't mean they know necessarily what to do to form the union. And that's where the organizer steps in and says, this is what we need you to do. We need you to join the committee. We also need you to actively ID other people like you, or we need you to have these conversations with people who trust you. Because what happens is, a lot of people will sign and form a union, yes, through information and knowledge. Like, this is going to transform our workplace. But a lot of people are followers. That's where I wanted to add on. So a lot of people will be like, you know what? I respect, this person in my workplace. He is a leader. He told me, he called me on Saturday. He said, you need to sign this union card. We need better salaries. We need to have time off. Sign it right now. And that person will be like, okay. Because what the methodology has shown us is that it's really, you can win over, because you have to move quickly too in these campaigns because of the boss fight that's going to come, right? So you really need to move quickly. And the way you can move quickly is when you've ID'd properly leaders, but you also need activists. And so activists are people who can execute tasks. Sometimes people who can execute a task, like, book a room, attend meetings, share the meeting, do outreach. Sometimes they're activists and they're really good at that. And that's why we need everybody. We do need leaders and activists. But once you get leaders, I think it just spreads faster, if that makes sense. A campaign can spread faster if you have like more leaders on your organizing committee.
Yeah, I'm just realizing I could talk to you all day about the sort of arc of how this works. It's every part of it's fascinating, but I just want to give the sort of viewers and listeners a bit of the overall arc. Like, I guess my question is, how are workers, whether they're how does somebody go from just being a follower who like signs a union card because somebody basically told them to, or told them it's a good idea, and they are a follower, so they it might resonate with them to some extent, but really an intrinsic part of the motivation is this, or just sort of like we're social animals, basically, is what I'm hearing. But how do you go, how do people get transformed from that into like a self-determining activist who's like taking part in democratic decision making and taking action?
Okay, I thought you were going to ask, how do they become a leader? I said sometimes they can't become leaders.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I mean, yeah, some people, obviously people are going to have different roles, but yeah,
people have different roles. Well, how you become more of an activist is what we do. The organizer works with them. So I work with activists all the time. And like, I help build them by giving them the training. First, I meet them on one meeting and I go through, this is the law and these are the barriers. But you've already started. You're coming together. You're meeting at Tim Hortons. You're talking. You built a WhatsApp. People are on the WhatsApp team. They're reading the material and then kind of helping them build knowledge. And a lot of activists, I'm doing training. I'm trying to task them little by little, not overwhelming people, because again, a lot of people are doing this, with very little time. And that's why sometimes people try to understand what a labor organizer role is. They have to understand that a lot of people aren't privileged. People are working 2 jobs. They have kids. They need the staff organizer to book a room, to pick a restaurant, like wherever you're meeting, the venue, the logistics. We're building lists. If the workplace has 100 people, we're checking names, we're helping verify, because no person really has time for that, right? But we always want to train people. We're always looking for activists and leaders who want to take on roles, because honestly, for me, 10 years, how I've had so many victories is just people taking on roles. It makes my life a lot easier if somebody can take on an or Excel sheet or anything, right? And so what I do is I task, and I do tasks that are doable. So maybe the first task is, why don't you talk to 2-3 people, and what are you going to say? And I go through, that's where role play comes in. How are you going to talk about the union, and what are you going to say? And we sort of discuss it out. Sometimes one person's issue, I train them. Maybe that's your issue, but you're going to have to listen, because maybe that's not their issue. So if you're only talking about, I'm upset, I lost my, overtime, maybe when you go talk to other workers, they're going to be like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, that doesn't impact me. I don't want the union because the overtime doesn't impact me. And sometimes I'm often training activists how to talk, how to have a conversation, because really a big part of our work too is communication. And in this kind of alienated world, again, it's my theme in my work, alienation. A lot of people just don't even know how to talk to each other. And so I take activists who want to do stuff, and there's a lot of people who do that, and give them one task, two tasks, and then I start seeing, oh, this person's amazing. Like 10 cards are signed. They showed up a couple meetings. They drove someone to a meeting, and so I love to give more where a person wants to do more, and then sometimes those people become really active in the union, active in the bargaining of the collective agreement, and so forth.
Yeah, that's super helpful. This might be a bit of a tangent, but I feel like the way you're sort of describing things sort of fits into sort of a pet theory I have about how people work in groups, and my sense is that everybody's going to have strengths and weaknesses, and of course you need people to play different roles at different times, and that's not necessarily to say that everybody can't play each of the roles necessarily, or be trained to do that, but we also have sort of propensity. So there's always this sort of give and take, I think, between your natural strengths and your sort of talents, and being sort of conscious of what those are, and then being conscious of how those fit into the bigger scheme of things, but then also being willing to step back and not get too attached to a particular role, and let other people sort of develop their skills and ability to fulfill different roles, whether it's being maybe there's one person who's loud on the megaphone and they can step back and let the quiet person do that, or encourage the quiet person to do that once, or maybe somebody who's really comfortable taking care of spreadsheets can do more of the like communications role.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously you want to do that sort of stretching around the edges of their comfort zone, as opposed to just like throwing people into different roles that they're not necessarily suited for.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious how that plays out. And in particular, I'm curious like how sort of conscious people are, because I think like I think, to take one of your earlier examples, somebody who is like ready to like read Marxist theory and get on the mic and yell at the boss is not necessarily going to have the trust of their coworkers, but might conceive of themselves as wanting to be in that position of being sort of a leader, even if they're sort of manifestly not, by that criterion that you had of having followers. So yeah, I guess I'm curious what your observations are in terms of people being conscious of their limitations, but also wanting to transcend them, or how that sort of plays out.
I think with we call it external organizing, which is a union drive, like where nobody is unionized. And I feel like people don't really want to be labor organizers in the sense of external organizing, because it's really hard. So you just get really different dynamics with external, because it's so hard. And what I mean by that is labor law is not easy to navigate. It's lobbied by, employers. And I know this, and your viewers probably know this. So it's just really hard to form unions. That's why I think maybe the viewers don't know this, but like across the country and in North America, like it's not easy to join a union, whether it's in service sector, whether it's in auto, it's not easy. So you hear about like a lot of failed campaigns, or campaigns that have been going on for years. So I just think you get different types of dynamics with more places that are non-union, where you have more a desire to socially like exist together and work together. And that's why I think I love it so much, because when you organize workers that are in a union, it's agitation and anger that fuels their movement. And I think that they really have a lot to lose, People think they have nothing to lose, but whether you're a poorer worker, working poor, working class, they have a lot to lose. They could be fired, they could be disciplined, the campaign could fail, and they may carve out a lot of their own time, right? So they're carving out their own time to build a kind of a community in response to their struggle. The workplace is a place of struggle, right? And a place of oppression in many ways. And the community gives them hope. It gives them, oh, like if we say something, if we write a letter, even if they don't form the union, if we write a letter and we say, it's not okay what you're doing. In the pandemic, we saw workers doing that. They're acting like a union, and it made them feel better and stronger. So I feel like that's why organizing externally is so fun, because you have people who don't have a union and have that voice, collective voice, and the collective voice and the organizing is so transformative. I think where you see more different dynamics pop out is when there's an existing union, right? And then there's internal organizing, or there's a strike, or there's bargaining happening, and then you have organizing. We call that organizing as well, where you're trying to ID leaders and activists to help on the strike. And that's where you do see different dynamics come out, because people want to do roles sometimes that they may not be good at. I think that's where I was leading to, because that they're not necessarily good at. And so I think where I see the strongest locals or the strongest organizing drives, I'll say that, is when people understand where they're good, what they're good at. And maybe they'll try other things out, but they'll be like, I'm really good at sitting and doing signs. Like, I'm an artist, I'm going to paint, I'm going to sit in the office, and that's the best use of me. And I have like maybe an ongoing disability or whatever, but the best use of me during this strike is to do artwork for our team, or to make music, and I think like where I feel it's more fruitful as an organizer is to allow people to do what they're really good at. Versus, I think you mentioned this, where I think organizers fail is when you volunteer someone, and then we call it overtasking. So let's say you're on a strike and I overtask you with things that you just simply can't do. And then what happens is the person fails at it. And then it's not a good feeling, right? So when you want accountability in a communal space and in a community, you want people to do things that they're good at and that they can execute. So it shouldn't be overbearing.
I mean, those seems like lessons that can absolutely be applied to a lot of other contexts, not just labor organizing. But
for sure.
So thanks for that. I mean, yeah, what's fascinating to me is like, watching workers, especially go on strike maybe for the first time, or just how much there's sort of this like, really, it seems transformative, the sort of social cohesion that happens, but then also this expression that happens, like people really unleash their creativity, and you see people doing, I don't know, like all kinds of like dances on the picket line. You see people like all of a sudden artistic talent like blossoms in different like kind of amazing ways. People get creative and clever and funny. It's such an amazing thing. I guess on a similar note, one thing I wanted to ask you about is, one thing that I've noticed about sort of strikes and picket lines and labor organizing is how transformative that sort of feeling of solidarity is. That sort of idea of an attack on one is attack against all really kind of becomes actualized in real life. And so especially on when there's picket lines or something, when I don't know, like a truck tries to drive through a picket line or something, and then people stand up, and then a video of it gets circulated through all the Facebook groups or whatever messaging groups of all the other union members, and it has this incredible sort of catalyzing effect where it just takes people into a completely different space in terms of their level of felt solidarity, their commitment to the struggle. Like all these things just seem to like amp up, and that's just something that I've observed as somebody who's not a union organizer but has worked with unions. I was just wondering if you could comment on, I mean, I guess is that a kind of experience that you get to see as a union organizer, and maybe if you could comment on how you sort of see that sort of, I guess, quantum leaps in that sort of felt sense of collective solidarity that happen and when they happen.
Yeah, exactly what you said. I was on a strike line in Hamilton. I was working with the Amalgamated Transit Union, and they were striking at a really good site downtown, and I think there was a hockey game going on and cheerleading and all that, and a lot of moms, I don't want to say, the race and everything, but, felt I got to get my kids in. My kids are super special. They're better. That's the attitude, right? And it really exposes class. It really exposes class, and I think Hamilton understands class very well, and it really exposes fractures and division, and it opens it up and shows you actually, all white people don't feel the same about each other. There's white working class and there's white rich people, and white rich people think it's okay to drive their car through a picket line and thinks it's acceptable, and he doesn't understand the struggle of a person on strike and how difficult it is, and it really does transform because you're all standing there in solidarity together, regardless of your race, regardless of your abilities, regardless of your sexual orientation. And I think that it unites people. Like when the world is constantly obsessed about how we're all so different, it's like, oh, you could look at that strike line and be like, well, we're all so different, but we're all here and we think this is wrong. And it makes it really visible who the enemy sometimes is, right? And it also brings people together because they're like, they have memories. People have memories of strikes that they've been on together, and it brings those relationships together because people have time off. They have also, it's like in this way you have time to like talk again. I think there's something about alienation that is so awful, like workplaces and like what's happening in this like Elon Musk whatever world we're living in. It's like nobody talks, and I feel like it's really impacted my work even more. Like there's just like people can go through days without like talking, so a strike does the opposite and it brings conflict. And it's almost like it's, for me, I'm like, yeah, for you to have a difficult conversation, it might be difficult, but it's good you had it. So maybe you all should just talk about it. And then you can see how much you actually understand each other, care about each other. And I think that the last thing I'm going to say is I think people are really lonely, really, really lonely. And I think we used to have pre-pandemic more like civic society, more communal, now it's changed post-pandemic. And I think that the strikes and direct action and the union has to do the opposite and bring people together.
Amazing. And I guess in your experience, does it?
Yes. People ask me often, like, I had an organizing drive in the pandemic and I was being like interviewed about it from like a labor journalist. Remember, they're like, so how much are they making? How much like is the union going to get them? And I kept saying, that's not the reason why they didn't even look at a collective agreement. These were early childhood educators outskirts in the suburbs. I won't say where it is, but because you might not know. But like they were part-time workers that don't know each other. They supply in the schools, and the reason they formed a union is because they were like, oh, the union, the Elementary Teachers Federation, is hosting like get-togethers so we can talk about our problems. Nobody cares about us. Like the school board isn't doing it. Doug Ford isn't doing it. Like the government isn't doing it. But we take care of your children, and we like come to work every day, and nobody's asked us how to improve, our work or our lives, or asked about us. And it's simply about me providing a space where they can come, talk together. And I create like a space, whether it's online and all these spaces for them to, talk about their work life. They all live in a certain community, what's going on, what are the challenges. And I think that they are coming together specifically to be able to connect with each other and to have relationships.
That's such a fascinating insight in terms of, yeah, you think of unions as being started like for the express purpose of increasing wages or whatever, but obviously just rebuilding the shredded sort of social fabric of our of our society, or like trying to weave together some kind of sense of community. I could see being a really powerful motivator too. So that's an interesting example. I guess to try to bridge this again, skipping over a whole bunch of other things we could talk about, but I just wanted to touch on the sort of bigger picture. So you go into a workplace, people start down the path of becoming activists, becoming leaders, developing their skills, developing their understanding, obviously going through conflict with the boss, like changing their sort of lived experience of being in solidarity, of working in solidarity. And I think, a certain number of those people end up going way beyond the workplace, getting involved in political campaigns, getting involved in all kinds of different broader movements for essentially social transformation. What is the first step of expanding beyond the workplace, beyond those initial sort of like breaking out of alienation, increasing your wages or whatever?
Yeah. Again, a big part of my work is I am lent to campaigns as well. So when elections happen, when political campaigns happen, lobbying happens against the government that affects membership. So whatever union I'm working with, if it directly affects our membership, yes, we're involved. And I'm often lent to those campaigns. And I do love working on those campaigns too, because again, I'm actively IDing our membership. So that's where I'm IDing the union membership. And I had the opportunity with the elementary teachers to do locals in the north. So by the north, I mean like Barrie. I know Barrie's not really north, but all the way to Thunder Bay and Kenora. And in those situations, I was, a lot of those areas are rural areas. There's reserves. We have Indigenous First Nation members, and we have members that have been like doing more online, teaching. They were doing more online pre-pandemic because of the geography, the vastness of geography. So there, I was actively, looking through our membership and looking where are our Indigenous First Nation teachers or members that are very active, who like love doing union stuff, and like how can we recruit them? And maybe we can even recruit them to the election canvassing, or maybe we can even recruit them to do more, come to the city and do more union organizing. But I also was like very successful, like IDing someone who ran in their community for a political party, at that time the NDP. So, kind of like IDing is a big part, identifying people who would be good at it. And I think that that would not only have followers in the workplace, but could now step up in their community and maybe make those links between the workplace and the community.
Tell me a bit about the Northern People's Coalition. What is that, and what was your sort of role in it?
Yeah, so when I was working with the elementary teachers, like I said, I had the opportunity to work with all these Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie, and I got to meet amazing members, members who really understood, the importance of social issues like infrastructure, water, public, the protection of the public, you know, like, sorry, I'm drawing a little bit blank, but I think you understand public infrastructure.
Mhm.
And really, I found it easier to organize in the north, actually, around even the NDP, because the candidates in the NDP, and I know we know each other through some of that, but like they understood, socialist issues, and what it means to have good public services. And I found like the community is very united around that. And whether if they were white or whether they were native, they understood, that we need the government to fund, right? Like we need the government to use our taxes, not to fund other things, but they need to start funding, this resources that we all use. And my experience was really good with the Northern People's Coalition. I sort of set it up with the Canadian Labor Congress, a few other groups, and the Rosa Luxemburg. Also, the New York office helped us like develop some webinars for members living in those areas, and we hope to continue that work. It's hard because again, there's really remote communities, right? Like so Kenora or like Fort Francis and these areas, like the only way to get to them was through small charters, which I did. And again, my experience was really uplifting. People are very welcoming, people, and that's why I really champion rural areas. And I like organizing in rural areas because people are really like, can people come from the city and visit us? Like, can they visit us? Like, and like talk to us because we understand. And we want more housing. We need better roads. We need better telecommunication. We need clean water, and we don't need them dumping garbage in our backyards. And I think that the cities really need to look at these areas and do more work in them because people are awesome, but also they are left out often, right?
It's interesting because you think of, obviously people in rural areas, are disproportionately maybe like dependent or need or benefit from public services, and yet I think these areas are often sort of seen as conservative sort of strongholds.
Mm-hmm.
Um, give or take some other, this sort of, there are some exceptions, but by and large, I think people think of rural areas as leaning more conservative, and the left being more in the urban areas. But yeah, maybe you could just talk briefly about your
Yeah.
sort of experiences in terms of the connections to, I don't know, whether it's social democratic or
Yeah.
sort of more left wing ideas.
I like that you asked me this too, and maybe I wish we'd spoken the pandemic. But like, I really feel that people do, like, there is a long history of whether it's social democratic, socialist, communist history in rural areas. And I think that I haven't had the opportunity to read about it, but I've had the opportunity to experience it. That people understand, again, the need for infrastructure, the need for healthcare, the need, even if there is a, colonial, like violence between rural white settlers, right, and their history with native communities, I still think they still understand public infrastructure, they still understand public health. And I found, even working with Indigenous First Nations members of ours that lived in the area, a lot of them vote NDP, they understand. I think where the conservative comes in is, again, the party apparatuses hyperfixation on city stuff, and that's why they've left, and maybe that's a whole different episode. Like, I think in the upcoming elections, they're going to lose areas that they traditionally had a stranglehold over. And I think that's where we saw the Freedom Convoy, People's Party, sort of libertarian, whatever it is. I don't even want to say negative things about it, because I just understand that when people haven't been approached with the left alternative, and they're just left there. And when I did knock on doors, I'll give a clear example. When I knocked on doors in North Bay, Sudbury, I saw a lot of People's Party. People's Party is like this right wing, and I think maybe your viewers know about it. It's a right wing party, and it was people who are very vulnerable, like renters and seniors who are renting in like deplorable conditions. The housing conditions are so bad in Canada, and like the way we've left retirees, it's just the food. Someone said to me at a door, I just take a gun and I get my own meat. I'm not going to go to a grocery store, and he's like, I don't care if it's illegal, so that's like, and I saw People's Party flags and F Trudeau flags everywhere. And I just think it's because they've been left behind, just like everybody else in this country. I think it's worse when your community doesn't have clean water or roads, proper internet, and like you're still paying crazy prices. So I just think that's why they've moved towards these like conspiracy theories and everything else. But then I also think people in the city have moved towards that too, because there's just no alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, you make the case from deplorable conditions into the basket of deplorables, as Hillary Clinton might say.
I was going to
Go
say
ahead,
one thing.
yeah.
Are people conservative? I know people kept saying this to me. People are socially conservative, but I find people I'm Muslim. I grew up in the city. I find people in the burbs here are socially conservative. And I find that they're moving towards more social conservatism masked as, I don't know, fascism, eugenics, whatever you want to call it. Like, I find it amongst all communities, and I find it's like wrapped up in this like like eugenics, like we hate everybody, and like you have to be pure in this way. And I feel like the rural areas have it, and so do the city people. I think that people think the cities are super progressive, but like, look what's happening, and we're going to see the results on the elections as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you make a pretty persuasive case. I mean, implicitly anyway, that the institutions that we do have should be putting a lot of resources into, as you say, approaching people and just knocking on doors and organizing and making sure that people have contact with a different set of ideas, because they don't. They just pick up what's lying around on or coming in through their Facebook feed or whatever it is. Yeah, I wanted to sort of, I guess, moving outwards, from the workplace to the sort of region. You talk about the regional organizing and the sort of political organizing, but you've been involved in a lot of international solidarity work yourself, and I'm really curious. Obviously, but then you're talking about talking to people who are like having libertarian sort of lawn signs, and obviously, we're in the sort of moment where Elon Musk is like cutting the heart out of. I mean, regardless of what USAID actually does, that's a whole other story. Just the fact that they're cutting foreign aid and being cheered on by such a large number of people, I think, speaks to the sort of, I don't know, resentment of of the idea of like helping people internationally. And so I'm so curious, with your experiences and ideas, and maybe you can talk about the sort of work you do in terms of international solidarity, but does that come up in conversation with the sort of organizing that you do? And if it does, like what is the sort of horizon where you can sort of live in the same world even as these people, who haven't been approached by a different set of ideas and who haven't experienced, solidarity in their workplace, much less, internationally.
Yeah, I think maybe that's a question on USAID. Maybe I'll add that at the end. But like I've had the opportunity through the union to understand internationalism. I graduated with a gender studies degree from York University. I did development studies, and I really saw myself working for a UN type body. I'm from Pakistan, so I had two opportunities, one in Beirut and one in Islamabad, which is in Pakistan, to take up. But life happened, and I ended up staying in Canada for health reasons, and I got grabbed up by a union. And I think the union really helped me kind of understand, because I really was starting to know and have more relationships with people who work in development, something like USAID, or people working for NGOs in countries and working in offices in countries that are tied to aid economy. And I think the union really changed how I looked at things. And what I mean is it made me understand that we need worker ownership, we need worker struggle, and workers in other places and workers in Canada don't need charity. And do not need charity. So with that, I would say that we should not be relying so heavily on food banks. Food banks is not transformation. Rich people standing on Christmas giving food to the poor little people, and being like, I'm going to show up in my really fancy car and give you food if you deserve it. And then we're going to call the police on you to remove you from your encampment because we don't understand, because we're slumlords. That world is something that I can't champion. And I see that world, whether it's like through imperialism extended to the global south that has been trapped in debt, financing, and poverty, and not actually free. So my question is around the aid economy and charity, whether it's inside this country or whether it goes outside. It is an industry. And I think people need to understand that it makes money, and it keeps people in debt, and it keeps people in poverty. And it's about moralizing who deserves what. Where unions, this is where I learned the internationalism from, is that unions are about workers understanding how do we take control of what's around us, and how we're better at governing and taking control, and like we're better at like leading, and we know what's just, and we know how to live communally, and we know how to live with the land, we know how to live with what we have. And like so many societies, through the work that I've done and learning from delegations, so I've been to Cuba, I went on a brigade to Cuba, or like learning from delegations that visit from the global south, you get the opportunity to learn how in different cultures, different societies, different languages, and different histories, there's a really good book that I would plug from Iskra Books about Iraq, the history of communism in Iraq, and it like talks about its ties to Islamic history and like liberation theology. But even with Christianity or indigenous faiths or different cultures, it's like people understand, how to live through, we talked about this, but like mutual aid, giving, land, trust with the land, with the animals, and really I got to learn that through the union, through workers, rather than through this idea of we're going to come and save, we're going to go to save somewhere. I'm going to go to Pakistan. So that's where my journey with development work ended, because it's like, Pakistan doesn't need me to come sit there and like look at them with a magnifying glass, from my privileged lens. And they would definitely let me know I'm privileged, So it's just, but when you do union work, it's different because workers are informing us, about what they've done and what they've been successful at. So when I've been to Cuba, for example, give an example, I got to hear from workers in an art collective, the rights they've gained through the family code. I learned about like maternity leave and like parental leave and extended parental leaves. And I got the opportunity to hear all that through workers. And I think it benefits me to see that, like, not everything's like Canada, and that Canada also you can't look at Canada's laws in isolation also. Canada's laws have been impacted by like the history of the Soviet Union or the history of democratic socialism in other places. So through internationalism offers us an opportunity to learn from other successful stories of workers in their resistance and in their revolution. And it really can inform what we do in the next years coming.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Yeah, it's sort of interesting to reflect on I guess the really two different kinds of relationships. One is like a relationship of charity, which is a relationship of dependency, which is a relationship of sort of a superior taking care of a inferior at the bottom of it, but also a relationship of control, whereas a relationship of sort of mutual aid and solidarity is really a relationship of equals and learning from each other, from each other's experiences, but also acting in solidarity in tangible ways as well. Yeah, I'd love to come back to sort of how when is that fluid then? Like when you're in the sort of labor organizing context, and I don't know, you finished your organizing meeting and you're having tea with people, like what does the conversation about sort of international solidarity look like, and how does it resonate or not resonate with people who are sort of earlier in the stage of sort of organizing themselves?
That's a good question, but I'll give you a clear example where I experienced international solidarity. In Canada, we've the Canadian postal workers who were just on a strike. They have a history of sending delegations to occupied Palestine and working with the Palestinian postal workers. And I've had such a privilege of learning from the Palestinian postal workers, because the Canadian postal workers have sort of supported that worker to worker conversation. And so when I attended Labor Notes in the United States, it was actually the Canadian Postal Workers Union that brought to Imad. His name is actually Imad, and he's great. You should have him on your show. But they brought him to Chicago, and I'm also a worker, right? So I got the opportunity, not only as a labor organizer, but as a worker, to hear, hey, like, there's a Palestinian postal worker here telling us about his day-to-day struggles doing his work, whether it's wage theft from the Israeli state, whether it's like an illegal occupation, mass prisoning, child detention, list is long. But I don't need to go necessarily to an aid organization or a charity, because there's lots of charities in my own community. Like I said, I'm Muslim, but I learned through a Palestinian worker talking to us about the occupation, the colonialism. And I think it's informed me to understand that actually, it doesn't matter too, like charities tend to focus a lot about, morality and goodness and what's like humanity, but workers can do that and tell us about that. And then they can tell us how they're struggling. And then how can we show solidarity to them? And Palestinian trade unions have said to us, unions around the world can show solidarity by the boycott divest movement, by participating in that peaceful movement, that's had its lessons from, the boycott movement against South African apartheid, but also calling for an arms embargo, right? So those are some ways that I've like learned how to do solidarity through internationalism and worker to worker conversations. And you asked the second question and I was going to answer that, right?
What do those conversations look like with people who are maybe newer to organizing themselves or their workplace? what is the gap between where you are in terms of your, experiences that you just described, and where they are, and yeah, I guess how do the sparks fly across that gap, or do they?
Yeah, that happens a lot. There's a gap, yeah. And sometimes workers get an opportunity to attend something and they don't necessarily know. They think like, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know like our money is going to like starve Haiti or like to starve the Cuban people. I had no idea, but I've traveled to Cuba or I've traveled to places and I didn't know how the Canadian government is using our taxes. So it can be a moment of learning. And I find like a lot of people are actually just like open to learning, but obviously you do have pushback, right? Because most of the knowledge that we have, the political knowledge, is coming from TV. It's coming from social media devices. It's not even coming from the news anymore. It's coming from instant images. People, I don't even know if they're actually taking the time to understand the political system that they live in. People can't even really understand how their workplace or their paychecks, like what, like it's we're in this moment like where people don't have this sort of political understanding or literacy on some of this stuff. And it doesn't matter how educated or not formally educated or not educated. I find a lot of people don't understand. For example, they don't even understand the housing crisis. So if they don't understand the housing crisis, why would they understand an international issue? But again, ordinary people always amaze me at how solidaristic they can be and how they can understand hearing it from another worker and saying, that really impacted me and I'm really bothered that, our taxes do XYZ. And I think that we need to change. We need a different system. People shouldn't have to stand at a food bank for grocery up here in Northern Ontario. We should be having our own, public infrastructure on internet and it builds a moment where they start getting consciousness. And it's not always perfect. It's not a perfect journey. And sometimes there's pushback for some people who have their own political perspectives. But I've noticed it being positive more than negative.
Amazing. And I guess where this whole conversation has been leading, and maybe a a little on the late side for me to bring it up an hour in, but I'd love to hear, I guess, your reflections on, we've talked about sort of, people get like breaking out of alienation. We've heard about people sort of advocating for themselves and sort of how and building that sort of consciousness and practice of solidarity. But where do people start to have sort of an experience or an understanding of capitalism itself, and I guess of the idea of moving beyond capitalism, or having an imagination about what it might mean to move past capitalism? That being the theme of the show, of course. Yeah, I'd love to hear any reflections that you have about sort of where that happens for people, or if it happens at all. In that labor organizing context.
I think it's going to happen and it is happening, and it's going to happen through the union. And I think it's going to happen because things are getting really awful, whether it was with the situation with landlords across this country. It's not just in Toronto. The lack of housing, the lack of food, the food prices are, preposterous. Like it's ridiculous. We have so much security standing everywhere. So I see the clash going to happen. I just think that the union has to be ready to absorb it and be ready to support those movements that are going to happen, whether it's like through rent strikes, whether it's through food, I don't know, food situations that leads to some sort of like organizing around that, because the prices are so unlivable for people that people are going to. And we've started to see rent strikes, but we don't get news coverage of it. So that's the other problem. But I think that the union is going to be a place where we're going to have to start moving outside of business unionism and just looking at the bargaining table and start really supporting our communities that are resisting what these corporate governments are trying to shove down their throat, that there's like nothing else that they can do. And I think it's going to be workers who are the younger workers who are literally have no housing, no cars, No, there's nothing for them to really lose besides gain. They're going to gain from a fight. And so I think it's going to come from them. And I think that the pandemic saw how unions were kind of like back into people's minds in the service sector. And I think people need to stop looking at manufacturing and all that. They need to start looking at like this other worlds of work, you know, whether it's food, service, all this like tech and aesthetics and all this type of acting and everything. That's where people are looking at unions and they are like, okay, and they want to like organize and they're involved. A lot of people are plugged in their communities, whether it's around mutual aid, whether it's around like cooperative like groups like farming. So they understand that, oh, we have to resist this mainstream. Something's wrong with the status quo. And in communities that are more rural too, I think that they are also understand. And I think that we're going to see movement in places that we didn't even expect, maybe.
And so, yeah, I'm so curious, like, you know, how do you see capitalism as a concept sort of emerging? I mean, obviously all the things you're describing are sort of a result of a system based on accumulation and exploitation, and that, you know, that creates artificial scarcity and you know, all these things that we sort of know intellectually about capitalism, but how does that start to come into view for people, like, and how do they make the connection with this sort of thing that is more conceptual, or is that even necessary? Because I mean, it seems like the statistically more likely thing is that people turn to sort of conspiracy theories, and then that becomes their sort of way of explaining the world. But yeah, I'm just curious about your sort of on the ground view of how those things get connected, and then how people start to imagine, like, what kinds of things do people imagine happening if, you know, outside of capitalism, or, you know, if they do at all.
I think they will. I don't fully know how they will get there. That's a big question. In Toronto, we're hosting the Starbucks Workers United. They're coming here to do a training that I'm helping with. And my niece is going to it, you know, and she works at a movie theater. And I think that they have ways that they're learning. They're learning not necessarily just through TikTok, Red Note, whatever. They know there's something up. They don't believe anything, but they need to find something that they believe in. And I do think the union is persuasive, and something about resistance is persuasive, because when they wanted to galvanize and come out in numbers around Black Lives Matter during a global pandemic where people were like struggling and they don't have money in their pockets, they did it and they sedated that. And when with the Palestinian like mobilizations, people get it. I think a lot of people get it. They just try to sedate it, co-opt it, whatever. The government fight back, the police fight back. But I think that they do get it. They need to figure out how to collectively come together again in spaces that are in real life. That's what I think. They need to imagine going back to in real life and stop like hiding in alienation and behind tools and apps and all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It seems like we don't have too much trouble getting a bunch of people into the streets for something that's urgent. Like, you know, I mean, there were thousands and thousands of people every week for Palestine rallies here in Montreal, certainly for months. But getting people into a space to like have a movement assembly or like be a part of a sustained organizing initiative, that seems quite a bit harder. Is that your experience as well?
I think it's because, and I watched an episode of yours, and I think it's because we need structure. We need, and I don't think we necessarily need a party structure. I hate this obsession over electoral politics because I used to myself as a unionist be forced to do only electoral politics. But like, you need a structure, you need a worker organizations, you need worker unions, we need to get back to more structure. So even if you're doing a rent strike, you need a rent strike organization, you need like a little bit of like structure and like, you know, cohesion and like, you know, dues paying, you know, accountability, more accountability. because capitalism has made people very individualistic. Workplaces make you very individualistic, and again, everyone's super alienated, so they don't see people. There's a lot of people working who haven't seen people for a week. Like, that's the world where we're living in, and don't talk to people, don't even talk to their own family, you know? And so how do we pull people out of that? Because they know what's happening is bad, but how do we convince them to agitate them to go do more? And I think mobilizations, and you're right, we did the mobilizations, but we need a proper structure to build. But we also need a structure that's going to be strong to withhold all the surveillance, policing, you know.
It's a tall order for sure. Do you?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess do you? What kind? You know, I guess the part of the thesis of this show is that we need to sort of build these sort of intermediate structures of like economic cooperation and sort of prefigure the kinds of structures that we need, whether it's like popular organizations or cooperatives that, you know, undertake economic activity and do business in a different way, in a way that redistributes profits and fuels movements. And we need unions, and we need, you know, to for some value of the term, parties for sure as well. You know, and we need to do a lot of experimenting with that, and especially in this context where people are hyper fragmented and really and like you said, don't trust anybody. You know, except for that sort of, maybe that sort of direct visceral experience of seeing, you know, bombs falling or seeing their people getting potentially run over on a picket line or something, that then they can believe that, but otherwise they're very sort of dubious. But yeah, I'd love to hear your sort of thoughts on what the starting point is. What are the sort of what are the first rungs of that ladder toward building organization?
Well, I did write another piece, well, not many pieces, but I did write a piece in the Rosa Luxemburg about how the right is mobilizing and organizing and what the left should be doing. And I guess this is where I'm seeing what your question is. I think that in order for us to enter this post-capitalist world that I could imagine, is for us to learn from the other revolutions that I've been learning about through my internationalism. And it's definitely not a peaceful way of freeing ourselves, because it's so violent. You know, that's the other thing that I see every day in Toronto, how the system is so violent, how somebody who is like isn't even able-bodied can't even walk on a sidewalk, because the sidewalks and the streets are made for developers and the rich, but it's not made for a human being. How there's no public restrooms, how there's no public space. You know, I'm sometimes in Minnesota, there's no public spaces. You know, they purposefully, the police, the MPD have removed benches to prevent people from sitting. If you look at restaurants, a lot of restaurants don't have places for people to sit. You know, they don't want people to sit and eat or rest. You know, the violence is so large. And whether it's Palestine or whether it's here, we are living in settler violence. We are living in colonized spaces. And I think that the response from a multiracial, working class, working poor, whether it's rural people, city people, the response is only sometimes going to be direct action. And a response is at some point going to be like a violent response, because of everything that's happening to people, the way people are being treated. And I think that we need to see leaders and trade unionists, you know, support when movements happen. We need trade unionist leaders to help cultivate more structured organizing. That's what I was going to say. So when we see mobilizations happening, we need to support the anti-war movement. We need to support the abolition movement, but we need to be providing them with structure and our knowledge and our history of knowledge, because I think the union movement has so much history of, we're really good at structure, actually. You know, like if you have to do a strike, they're very good at it. But like, how do we build, you know, and how do we dream of something more? And in order for us to dream, we need stronger leaders that present alternatives, you know, that build structures for the working class and the working poor, but also lead us into direct action, not just, you know, collaboration or, you know, concession or business as usual. And I think that it's going to happen. don't know if it's happening right now, but I do have faith in the next generation because I just don't know how they're going to be able to live like this. And I do think that they have class consciousness because when you look at everything that they consume, there's ideas there, but they need to overcome like the lack of connection. And they need to overcome and like start having more analysis rather than just consuming. And I think it's going to be hard for them, but I think like the pandemic showed me that it is possible.
Well, it is possible. Seems like a great note to end on.
I don't want to be negative.
and I just wanted to, I guess, and also in wrapping up, I just wanted to really, just acknowledge how the sort of view that you provided earlier on in the conversation of like how leaderful, for lack of a more elegant term, our worlds are, our workplaces, everything else, like, and how, and I think if people take away anything from this, it's just like, going into a workplace, going into a community, going into, and like looking around and seeing those leaders and seeing the potential to develop, collective solidarity, collective action, with those as, with those sort of natural propensities and social networks as the building blocks, I think is a really powerful.
I hope so.
Powerful idea. Yeah. So thanks again, Aminah Sheikh, for taking the time.
Thank you.